Hi everyone, thanks very much for coming to Plutonium for Energy. My name is Alan Kuperman. I'm an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm also the coordinator of the Nuclear Proliferation Prevention Project. I want to thank, first of all, our hosts here at George Washington University and Sharon Squassoni. I also want to thank our funder, the MacArthur Foundation, who provided the bulk of resources for the research that you're going to hear about today. I want to thank also my four colleagues from whom you'll be hearing as well today: Valentina, Bonello, Neal, Mann, Hina, Acharya, and Kelli Kennedy. So what's going to happen today is I will give a brief overview of the project as a whole, and then my colleagues will provide the details of the case studies that they conducted in their countries. Our project is the first ever comprehensive comparative study of the fabrication and use of MOX fuel for thermal reactors. For those of you who are not technical and don't know the fancy words, that means the use of plutonium in fuel in traditional nuclear power plants. We did 7 country case studies portrayed here on the map, and as you'll see, there are 3 countries that both produced and used MOX. There's 1 country that produced MOX but didn't use MOX, and then there are 3 countries that used MOX but did not produce MOX. This was a year-long project, and I and my colleagues conducted field research in all 7 of these countries. The case studies that we're writing up are in the process of being finalized. They will be posted this month on our website. This is our website. It is already live, www.puforenergy.com. And then later this summer, the whole project will be published as an open access book. So you'll be able to download it or get a hard copy. So the question you might be asking is, why study MOX? Well, first of all, plutonium, which is an ingredient in MOX, is highly controversial for at least 3 reasons. First of all, you can make nuclear weapons from it. We're not talking about dirty bombs that kill 1 or 2 or 3 people. We're talking about real nuclear weapons like the one used at Nagasaki that can kill tens of thousands of people with 1 bomb. Secondly, it is extremely toxic, especially if inhaled. A tiny speck, if inhaled, is almost guaranteed to give you lung cancer eventually. And then lastly, plutonium, as you'll hear about today, can be very, very expensive to produce and use. The goal of this project is to inform some very, very big decisions that are pending in several countries right now. So for example, in East Asia, there are 3 countries that are seriously considering either initiating or expanding the use of plutonium for energy. China, contemplating getting into this MOX game. South Korea looking at pyroprocessing and fast reactors. And Japan, which, as you'll hear about today, already is in the game of using MOX, is seriously contemplating expanding massively that program. So that's in East Asia. In the US, we ourselves, even this week, are in the midst of a very big decision about the use of MOX. There was a deal with Russia to dispose of, the US would dispose of 34 tons of weapons plutonium. The original idea was that this would be done as MOX. The US Congress last year gave the Department of Energy the option of killing it. The Department of Energy decided to kill it. The state of South Carolina has gotten an injunction against that. The Senate is having second thoughts. So it is a lively issue this week. We didn't plan that, but that's the way it is. In the UK, as you'll hear about, they have 110 tons of civilian plutonium. And their leading option, at least officially, is to fabricate this into MOX and use it in reactors. They don't have a place to fabricate it, they don't have reactors to use it, but that's their plan. And the question is that a good plan? And then the last big decision pending is in France, which has the largest maker of MOX and the largest user of MOX, both of which appear to be going bankrupt, largely because of this fuel cycle. And the question is, if you're in a hole, should you keep digging, or should you possibly reconsider? And so we hope to inform all of these decisions. With our research, we examine 5 key aspects of MOX fabrication and use. As you see up here, economics, security, safety and environment, the performance of MOX fuel in reactors and fabrication, and the public acceptance of MOX. So what I'll do is just very, very briefly summarize the findings from these case studies. As I say, this project's going to be a book of about 250 pages, so I'm going to summarize that in about 2 to 3 minutes. And then you'll hear more detail from my colleague. So, first of all, in economics, MOX is much, much more expensive than the traditional fuel, low-enriched uranium, for 2 main reasons. First of all, to get the plutonium, you have to reprocess spent fuel. That is very expensive. But secondly, even if plutonium were free, MOX would still be many, many times more expensive than LEU, mainly because of the complications of dealing with toxic plutonium when you're fabricating fuel. You have to do all sorts of things that you'll hear about. Air purification, glove boxes, you try to automate. When you get accidents, you have to shut the place down for weeks or months to decontaminate. And then if you try to lower these costs, what you wind up doing is getting screw-ups that will often interfere with operation of the facility, which again increases the costs further. So those shortcuts often backfire. So that's economics. Security, what we found, which is pervasive and in a sense terrifying, is that security is not taken seriously, even though we're dealing with tens or even 110 tons of plutonium that is weapons usable. To put it into context, 110 tons of plutonium is enough for 10,000 nuclear weapons. And what you see is that in general, the industry does not take higher security measures for this plutonium fuel than it does for ordinary low-enriched uranium, which is not a bomb material. Third, safety and environment. There have been accidents at the fuel fabrication plants. They have both economic and political impact. In fact, I'd say the economic and political impact has been bigger than the health impact. In addition, spent MOX, that is, after you use MOX in a reactor, it turns out that spent MOX is a huge complication for waste disposal. And this is ironic because proponents of MOX say that MOX is very important for promoting nuclear energy. And in fact, what you find out, that MOX is important for simplifying waste disposal. And what you find out is that MOX actually complicates waste disposal. For example, has to cool for maybe 100 years. And so, well, we can't dispose of our spent fuel because we can't dispose of our spent MOX, but you'll hear more about that. Performance. Although MOX fuel had some problems in the early years, and we can talk about why, eventually they figured out how to use MOX fuel in reactors, how to produce it in a way that would work fine. So today, MOX fuel works fine in reactors. MOX fabrication, however, has often not turned out to work very well. And some of the facilities you'll hear about today produced at only 20% of their capacity, or all the way down to only 1% of their capacity. And you can imagine what that does to your economics when you build a facility and it produces only 1% of what you thought it would do. Now, why? Why has fuel fabrication turned out to be so problematic? And I think the answer is, again, has to do with the toxicity of plutonium. What happens is that there's great concern about contaminating workers, contaminating the environment, having a fire, all sorts of things. And so, therefore, they spend a lot of money, or plan to spend a lot of money to reduce these health threats. But then they say, uh-oh, this is not going to be affordable. So then they start cutting corners to try to make it affordable, and then the plant doesn't work very well. That is a overview. It is not true of every facility, and you will hear details about when it worked and when it didn't work. Lastly, public acceptance. MOX turns out to be more controversial than traditional low-enriched uranium fuel. And again, this is ironic because, as I said earlier, MOX is touted as something that's very important to promote nuclear energy. But what winds up happening is that because of the proliferation affiliation of plutonium and the toxicity of plutonium, it winds up undercutting public support, not just for use of MOX, but potentially for use of nuclear energy as a whole. So again, MOX appears to backfire in that way. So that's the overview, and I will now turn to the case studies. We'll be hearing about Belgium, then the UK, then Japan, and then Germany. As noted, we have 3 other case studies. The authors of those are not here today. We'd be happy to take questions about those as well. At the end, I also will refer you to a presentation we're giving tomorrow at the Stimson Center in the afternoon at 3:30, I think, and the author of the France paper will be there. If you have questions, I would ask you, if possible, to hold your questions to the end of all the presentations, but if it's a burning question, it's got to come out, then feel free, if necessary, to interrupt. And without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Valentina Bonello.
All right, so good morning, everybody. As you heard, I'm going to be talking about Belgium, and there are 4 main things that I want to do today. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about my case, and then I'm going to introduce you to my research questions, research methods, and then to the findings that I believe are the most interesting for this case. So Belgium has a pretty rich history with MOX fuel because it used to both produce and use MOX fuel. And using and producing MOX fuel was specifically a strategy to dispose of separated plutonium. Authorities in Belgium believed in fast breeder reactors. They did not materialize, so they had a bunch of separated plutonium that they had to dispose of. Belgium is a pretty small country, so there are only 7 nuclear reactors, 2 of which use MOX fuel, and they use MOX fuel from 1995 up to 2006, when Belgium exhausted all MOX fuel stockpiles. And today there is no MOX fuel in Belgium, no separated plutonium, and also Belgium decided to phase out nuclear power altogether. So there are also no plans to get back into producing or using MOX fuel. My research questions touched both MOX fuel use and production, and for each of these 2 topics I touched on 4 different aspects: safety and environment, security, economics, and public opinion, which means the impact that using and producing MOX fuel had on Belgian public opinion of nuclear power in general. To answer my research questions, I used primary and secondary written sources. Primary sources come from Tractebel, which is the engineering branch of the utility company that runs all reactors in Belgium, from Belgian Nuclear, which was responsible for MOX fuel production, and from the Belgian government. Secondary sources come from the IEA, from consulting companies that worked closely on the licensing and the safety assessment procedures, and Greenpeace, and I also consulted scientific articles. But more importantly, I had the chance to go to France and to Belgium to conduct field research. I interviewed 7 experts and academics that come from the nuclear industry, so Tractebel, Belgian Nuclear again, Greenpeace, from the Federal Agency for Nuclear Control, which is Belgium's nuclear regulatory agency, from the University of Liège, and I also interviewed 1 independent anti-nuclear consultant in France. Now we're going to talk about my findings, and we're going to start with MOX fuel fabrication and with safety and environmental aspects. It's very clear that producing MOX fuel poses more safety hazards to the employees working at the facility than producing LEU fuel. The reason for this is that MOX fuel contains plutonium, which, as we mentioned, is more radioactive, more toxic, and it also increases the risk of fire at the facility. So all sorts of safety hazards for the employees of the plant. Also, Greenpeace reported that the safety standards at the Dessel plant in Belgium, run by Belgian Nuclear, were also inadequate for three main reasons. First, the level of ammunition which was allowed at the plant was higher than average, and then in other comparable facilities, for example, the Hina MOX plant in Germany. Also, the equipment that was being used by the employees increased the risk of contamination, in particular glove boxes. And the third, the level of automatization of the facility was low, and especially compared to, again, the Hina plant, which was built around the same year in the 70s, but had a more automated process. Also, security aspects are very problematic because plutonium, when MOX fuel fabrication in Belgium started to happen at a commercial scale, was not being separated in Belgium. It was separated in France, à la Hague. And then it was loaded in safes and in a truck, and the truck would drive for 7 hours from La Hague to Dessel. So they would have weapon material driving for 7 hours, and followed by just one armored vehicle. The armored vehicle was not an army vehicle, it was a gendarmerie vehicle, and the gendarmerie is equipped with weaponry, slightly heavier weaponry than what is allowed to the police. So that is definitely a security hazard. Also, the routes that the truck would follow would be very predictable, according to an industry official, and there were only 2 possible routes, one of which would be selected randomly each time the truck left. But of course, as soon as the truck left, it would be very easy to understand which route it would take. And once the plutonium reached the fabrication facility, it would be put in a safe and then in a locker under surveillance, but at any time there would be a 1 year worth of plutonium supply at the facility for security of supply reasons. So that's another security hazard, also considering the fact that according to Greenpeace representatives, it would have been very easy to cross the gate and get into the facility at any moment. So the situation was quite problematic. And then economics, again, this doesn't look any better than what we have seen so far. Producing MOX fuel is undoubtedly more expensive than producing LEU fuel, even considering plutonium as free. And this translates in higher upfront investment costs. The investment cost for the Dessel plant was 10 times higher than what it would have been required for an LEU fabrication plant because of the need to install a very powerful air purification system. So the air purification system at the Dessel plant has the same area as the fabrication area itself, so it's massive. Also, once production started, production costs would still be 5 times higher than what would have been true for LEU. Again, the reason for this is the safety hazard and risks that are posed to the employees of the facility. So they need to install air monitoring systems and provide the employees with safety gears and glove boxes. That all increases production costs. Now we're going to transition to MOX fuel use. We're going to start again with safety and environmental aspects. The MOX fuel, because it contains plutonium, has higher gamma and neutron dose rate than LEU fuel, but the utility company actually dealt with this by installing additional emission monitoring systems. What's really problematic about MOX fuel use is, again, the security aspect in the case of Belgium, because it is true that IEA and Euratom inspectors would be allowed at any time at the facility for random inspections. Also, monitoring systems were installed, the personnel was trained, background checks would be run on each employee. But the problem is that these measures were not different from what was already in place for reactors using LEU fuel only. So the fact that plutonium was being used in nuclear fuel led to no improved security measures at the reactor site. And now economics, the handling and management of the reactor sites using MOX fuel was not that problematic. There were some engineering challenges. The fuel cycle length had to be adjusted. It went from a 14-month cycle length to a 12-month cycle length. But the real problem here is going to be, for Belgium, the management of the spent MOX fuel. Spent MOX fuel is 4 times as hot as spent LEU fuel, which means that you need 4 times as much space to dispose of it. because with spent fuel, you don't measure volume, you measure heat. So when Belgian government will have to finally dispose of its spent fuel, it will have definitely to face higher costs to dispose of the MOX fuel it has. And to end, public opinion. Belgium is a very peculiar case because Greenpeace Belgium made MOX fuel a staple of its anti-nuclear campaign, especially the transit of separated plutonium on Belgian territory became a very important issue for the Belgian public, especially the population of the areas that were interested by the transit of the plutonium. They were very receptive. They asked their representatives that this practice stop, and it stopped. When the Belgian authorities announced that they would phase out nuclear power, they actually mentioned the nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism threat of nuclear power as a reason for this choice. So in this case, MOX fuel definitely had an impact on the public opinion about nuclear power in general in Belgium. So this would be it. I would be happy to take any questions at the end. And yeah, thank you for your attention.
Quick question. I have a quick question from Mr.
So they've stopped, they're not reprocessing now?
No, they stopped reprocessing spent fuel already in the early 70s, and they outsourced reprocessing to France.
And the MOX, they've stopped the fabrication?
They stopped MOX fabrication. Yeah, there's nothing going on now. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Neal Mann. I'm a PhD student in the Mechanical Engineering Department at UT Austin. So my case study was in the United Kingdom, and I had 4 primary research objectives. So as I'll talk about in just a second, the UK had 2 primary MOX production facilities, the MOX demonstration facility and the Sellafield MOX plant, so MDF and SMP. So I wanted to know what happened with those projects and why they ended up shutting them down. I also wanted to know, although the UK was a large producer, potentially a large producer of MOX, why it never really pushed to use MOX in its own reactors, and then what the current policy of MOX fuel is in the UK. So the UK is actually a pioneer in the MOX fuel industry, not just for fast reactors, but also for thermal reactors. So really the production started in the 1960s with the Dounreay fast reactor program, and then the follow-on to that, the prototype fast reactor. In the 1980s, there was some movement in mainland Europe about MOX fuel, and British Nuclear Fuels Limited, or BNFL, got interested in this potential market segment, and so started to poke around a little bit and do some development work. That led to the MOX demonstration facility, which opened in 1994. So MDF ended up producing MOX fuel for Swiss, German, and Japanese customers. And then the follow-on to that plant was called the Sellafield MOX plant, and it was originally designed to produce 120 tons of MOX fuel per year, but it actually ended up producing less than 10 tons over its entire lifetime. So it produced a far smaller percentage than was originally planned. So this is the Sellafield site in Cumbria, northwest England. So the MDF is up in the far northwest quadrant. Now SMP was actually designed to be directly adjacent to Thorpe, which is the thermal oxide reprocessing plant, which was what drove the business of spent fuel from Japan and Europe. So it actually was co-located adjacent to that. So this map shows, so MDF and SMP is up there in green. The blue dots are where BNFL ended up actually producing MOX fuel. So most of it in Switzerland and Germany. And then in blue, there were several other contracts for MOX fuel that ended up having to be subcontracted out or otherwise paid out because they couldn't end up producing, and including one in Sweden. And then in Japan, fuel was actually produced for Takahama but never used, as I'll mention in a second. And then there was an additional contract with the Hamaoka plant. So MDF actually worked reasonably well for what it was designed to do, because it was really just a conversion of the fast reactor MOX production facility into producing thermal MOX. So ultimately, I think the main thing that this pioneered was a dry route for producing MOX pellets, which is unique around the world. All the other MOX production routes use some kind of aqueous process, but this one actually was dry, which had some significant environmental benefits. And it ended up giving a lot of, I guess, positive reinforcement to this idea of a thermal MOX program in the UK government. So that gave hope that SMP was going to work very well. So MDF ended up producing only about 44 assemblies. It was a relatively small plant. What really drove MDF to close was that there was a data falsification scandal that broke in 1999, where it turned out that there was some quality control checks that were just copied from a spreadsheet onto another one, because more or less the workers were bored of the work. It was really tedious. Ultimately, the government allowed BNFL to propose to reopen the plant, but they actually never did on a commercial basis. It was only ever meant to be a pilot facility, so they weren't really ever going to produce large quantities there anyway. And at the end of the day, it did prove out, other than the research reactor fuel that had been done earlier, that the short bindless root pellets worked reasonably well, and that they could expect to produce that at SMP. Now, SMP was the full-scale commercial facility that was meant to produce 120 tons of fuel per year originally. Unfortunately, BNFL really tried to cap the capital expenditures on building this plant. Originally, it only allocated about 300 million pounds, somewhere in that 300, 400 million pounds to build it. And that really constrained the design. So this building is actually extremely small relative to all the other MOX production facilities worldwide. And shoving lots of production equipment into a small area presents a lot of challenges from a production standpoint. Although MDF was meant to be a lead-in to SMP, the design of MDF was really very different than the design of SMP, and a lot of the processes that BNFL wanted to use at a large scale were essentially tested for the first time at scale. So that obviously led to a lot of significant bottlenecks. But there really were no problems with producing the pellets. So MDF's pellet production process worked just fine at SMP. Really what the problems were turning the pellets into the rods and then putting the rods into fuel assemblies. So part of what drove this in the UK was actually trying to reduce worker dose not only below EU standards, but they self-imposed essentially half of the standard dose in the UK as their benchmark. So that really led to a lot of automation of systems that had never been automated before, and that ended up leading to a lot of problems. The rod fabrication line in particular, where pellets are put into rods and the rods eventually go into fuel assemblies, actually was identified as one of the main bottlenecks, and they were going to replace that starting in 2010. So they shut the plant down after one of the orders was complete, and Areva, the French company, came in and actually started working on a replacement. Unfortunately, the Great East Japan earthquake and Fukushima Daiichi accident happened, and at the time, all the primary customers for SMP were the Japanese utilities. And so after the Japanese decided that we're going to put a pause on our whole nuclear program, their contracts evaporated, they had no other customers, so the government said there's too much risk to keep this open, and they just shut it down. So in the UK, there have been a lot of development, like in the US, of different reactor technologies. And I'm going to go over 3 of them in particular that have been used in the civilian sector over the last decades. So the Magnox reactors are the oldest ones, and some of the reasons why the UK never used MOX fuel, one is that because they were relatively old, when MOX was started to be in vogue in the late 80s and early 90s, they were already starting to look at retirements of them. So there wasn't expected to be any long-term availability of them. Secondly, the Magnox reactors used a metallic-based fuel, and we haven't mentioned it specifically, but mixed oxide fuel means that it's a uranium oxide, so it has oxygen in it, but Magnox fuel was metallic. So if you wanted to use oxide fuel in a Magnox reactor, you would have to go through a lot of testing and justification, and that actually was started in the early 20th century, 21st century with a program called Magrox, but they ended up deciding that was too expensive and there wasn't enough age left. And also, the Magnox reactors were designed to produce plutonium, not to burn it. So the conversion ratio was relatively high, so it didn't actually make sense if you wanted to burn down your stocks of plutonium to use this kind of reactor. Now, the advanced gas-cooled reactors is a more interesting case because they're broadly similar to water-cooled reactors. It's an indigenous UK design, built off of the Magnox program, but ultimately using an oxide fuel. it was very interesting reading the justifications from the different owners of these plants, especially in the 90s. How long are they going to last? So AGRs are even today in production and expected to be into the 2020s. But some people were saying early 2000s, all the AGRs will be retired. So some of the justification ended up not actually being the case. Part of the problem with the AGRs is that they were extremely unreliable at the beginning of their lives. Their capacity factors, or how much electricity they produced versus how much they could produce, are relatively low. And so they would have taken an extremely long time to produce or to burn down the MOX and the plutonium in it. So there's only one light water reactor in the UK that's operating right now at Sizewell B, and there has been some proposal to use MOX fuel in it, but because the amount of separated plutonium in the UK is so high, even if you were to use MOX fuel 100% loading in Sizewell B for the rest of its life, you wouldn't burn down all the plutonium. So it was sort of a, well, this would solve part of the problem, but it's not going to solve the whole thing. So, but ultimately, and I think someone mentioned earlier, talking about some of the new reactor builds. So Hinkley Point C is currently under construction in EPR, 2-unit EPR. There are proposals for several other reactors that are in various stages of development. And in talking to some of them who would talk to me a little bit, they're not interested in using MOX fuel right now. There's not really any economic incentive for them to use it. They know that it's more expensive than LEU. They also know that licensing a core with MOX is going to take additional time versus doing an LEU core, and they need to get their economics squared away and the plant producing as quickly as possible. So they just see MOX as a delay in their ultimate licensing process. So the UK has separated not only plutonium for making its own weapons, it actually has reprocessed a lot of its own spent fuel from the AGRs and the Magnox reactors. So they have this 110 some odd ton stockpile of separated plutonium. But ultimately in the UK, it's not really a large public issue right now. The Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, which inherited some of the assets of the old BNFL, it decided in 2014 that separated plutonium is actually a liability, which is a change. It used to be a zero cost, but they actually have admitted that it's a cost that needs to be considered. And even today, ultimately, they still officially support using MOX fuel burned in thermal reactors as their disposition policy. So in the end, the UK doesn't view nuclear power as a strategically important option for the UK as it did in the past, whereas before there were military aspects to it. Now it's very much, if it can stand on its own commercially, then we will support it, but otherwise it has to compete. So the economics are paramount in the UK, and Treasury is very unwilling to subsidize any kind of fuel. And of course, separated plutonium is both a liability and an asset, depending on your perspective. But there is definitely an ongoing cost of storing the plutonium at Sellafield, at least in the security arena. So thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Hina, Acharya, and my presentation is about MOX in Japan. It's titled Ambitious Plans Derailed. And so here's a quick overview. First, I will talk about background and history, so just about Japan's nuclear fuel cycle in general and where MOX fits into this history, the research objective, findings, and then since Japan's MOX program is ongoing, I have some recommendations. A quick background, 1954 is when the nuclear research program begins in Japan amid concerns of the country's lack of energy independence. And so a couple of years later, they're able to start their first boiling water reactor, which is experimental. And then in 1956, the Japanese Atomic Energy Commission releases its long-term plan for reprocessing. So this reprocessing plan is centered around fast breeder reactors. the government envisioned that fast breeder reactors would go commercial by 1985. And along with this long-term plan for FBRs, there's a short-term plan for mixed oxide fuel in light water reactors that would serve as a short-term plan to keep plutonium stockpile down while FBRs were being developed. As we know, fast breeder reactors pretty much fail everywhere. Japan spends about $17 billion trying to develop their FBR, but it fails. However, because of domestic and foreign reprocessing, the country ends up accumulating almost 50 tons of plutonium, which is enough to make thousands of nuclear weapons, of almost about 6,000. And so after this, MOX and light water reactors becomes Japan's long-term plan. So Japan says, we're going to keep reprocessing, but instead of going after fast breeder reactors, we're going to now use MOX and light water reactors to consume plutonium. And that is where we are at right now. So with that history in mind, you can see that Japan's reprocessing future and whether or not it's able to consume plutonium completely hinges on its MOX program. So my research objective was to understand Japan's experience of using MOX to generate energy. And within my findings, for the sake of time, I picked the most important findings. So I will talk about the original timeline and delays, the actual timeline, how many reactors used MOX, how much plutonium was irradiated, the economics, and the security issue. 1988 is when the plan for MOX was outlined by the Japanese government and utilities. This plan said that 12 light water reactors were to deploy MOX between 1997 and 2017. This start date was not met. We know that the first MOX shipment to Japan didn't even come until 1999. So in 1997, the plan was revised, and this plan said that 16 to 18 light water reactors was to use MOX from 1997 to 2010. This plan was revised again in 2005 when not a single reactor had yet to use MOX, and this end date was pushed to 2015 from 2010. So in reality, MOX fuel use began in 2009, not 1997 as originally planned, and until now, MOX has deployed MOX in only 5 reactors and not in 16 to 18 as they originally said and keep continuing to say. A really important research question I had was what caused these delays? Why was Japan not able to stick to its original plan? So the number one reactor, KEPCO's Takahama reactors, were meant to be the first ones to deploy MOX in 1999. And as Neal talked about, the BNFL data falsification scandal became known, and so anti-nuclear advocates in Japan were able to convince the local governments about the safety issues concerning MOX, and it got paused and the program halted in the Fukui prefecture, which is where the Takahama reactors are located for that time being. The second reactor meant to go online with MOX was TEPCO's Fukushima reactor. And here, with the precedent that BNFL had already set with its quality control issues, anti-nuclear advocates were able to prove and provide evidence that the companies that produced MOX for Fukushima, which was Belgian and French company, actually had lower quality control standards than BNFL. So this became a huge issue, and the local governor retracted prior consent that he had given for the MOX program. And then third, that was meant to go online was TEPCO's Kashiwazaki Kariwa reactor. And this is actually a really interesting story. I talked to Eileen Miyako-Smith, who was the director of an anti-nuclear NGO called Green Action at the time, and she still is. And she said that here there was already somewhat of an attitude that was anti-nuclear among citizens, and anti-nuclear advocates such as Green Action were able to go in, do some educational outreach programs with the public about how dangerous MOX fuel is, and they held a referendum, and citizens voted against MOX here. And then if you go back to the first one, KEPCO's Takahama reactors, it was again ready to start in 2004. However, another one of KEPCO's reactors, there was a fire there, and so MOX got halted again in 2004. So like I said, the whole rationale for reprocessing in Japan hinges on the fact that it will steadily consume the plutonium that they produce. So that leads me to ask the question, has this worked? Has the MOX program consumed plutonium? As you can see, the MOX program in Japan started in 2009 and then went until 2011 where it had to be halted because of the Fukushima incident, and then it restarted again in 2016. From 2009 to 2011, Japan was able to consume less than 2 tons of plutonium. And then in 2016, once it restarted again, they were able to consume less than 1 ton. So at the end of 2016, 47 tons of plutonium remained. So in total, less than 3 tons of plutonium has been irradiated in Japan. So in summary, no, Japan has not been able to show steady consumption of plutonium with the use in its MOX program. Another issue is that of economics. The average cost per MOX assembly is almost 10 times more than the cost of an LEU assembly, the traditional low-enriched uranium. However, the Japanese Atomic Energy Commission says that the proportion of MOX fuel loaded in reactors is small, and the effects of MOX fuel cost and the front-end costs are insignificant. And this was actually an attitude that a lot of people held, whether they were anti-nuclear, anti-MOX, or pro-nuclear or pro-MOX, is that the costs are pretty insignificant, they don't matter all that much. However, out of the 5 utilities that have used MOX, 3 have changed their monthly power rates to reflect MOX costs. So even though all these people are saying it's insignificant, utilities are still pushing the cost onto consumers. And this has huge implications because Japan's electricity market was liberalized in 2016, so now consumers have a lot more options, and they might be moving away from these companies that use nuclear power. Another really big issue is security. So transport is a huge issue in Japan because MOX is fabricated in Europe, and you have to get it all the way to Japan, which takes a long time. A little bit of history on that. In 1987, Japan was actually importing plutonium oxide, so not MOX fuel, but just plutonium oxide, and US Congress passed a law against air shipments of plutonium oxide. So in 1992, Japan's shipment of plutonium oxide was escorted by gunboat by the sea. Since 1999, Japan has not imported plutonium oxide, but MOX fuel, and it has insisted that since MOX fuel is less of a security hazard than plutonium oxide, it has insisted on lessening of security measures, and the US actually conceded to Japan, and so now shipments are done by very lightly guarded commercial ships. So basically what happens is 2 ships guard each other, and you're not supposed to know which ship the MOX is on, but anyone sitting at the dock watching where things are being loaded will know. And so that's a big concern. There have been some changes at the reactor sites themselves in terms of security, post-establishment of the Japanese Nuclear Regulatory Authority in 2011. Namely, these are that there's armed guards there now, and employees at the reactors have to go through background checks. But these are for all reactor sites, not just MOX. So MOX doesn't really have increased security measures. What I found through my research is that the Japanese government constantly downplays the security threats. For example, their official documents say that MOX is not a proliferation threat, which we know is not true, so that is very concerning. There are also a lot of back-end issues in Japan. So spent fuel pools are very close to capacity. There's approximately 3,000 tons of spent fuel stored at Amari Prefecture, and delays in the reprocessing plant has caused concerns that Amari Prefecture is serving as a final disposal site. So now if Japan, the government utilities want to build another interim storage site anywhere in Japan, the local government is very not likely to approve because it's shown this precedent of not starting reprocessing in a timely manner. So people will be scared that their prefecture is serving as a final disposal site and not approve of an interim storage site anywhere. In terms of future plans, MOX fuel in 16 to 18 reactors is still the long-term plan after all these years. The Atomic Energy Commission announced that approximately 6 tons of fissile plutonium will be consumed annually, but experts such as Frank von Hippel have done studies on this, and realistically only 4 reactors will operate in the next few years, consuming a total of 1 ton of plutonium in all 4 reactors, not each reactor. So this plan of approximately 6 tons of plutonium is very likely not to happen. So which leads me to my recommendations. My first recommendation is to set and announce accurate goals and increase transparency. So as you heard, since 1997, they've been saying 16 to 18 reactors. Thus far, they've been able to get to 5 reactors. Currently, only 3 reactors with MOX are online. So the fact that they keep repeating this 16 to 17 is a little concerning, and it's not likely to happen. Also, increasing transparency. utilities actually don't tell the citizens how much they pay per MOX assembly, and at the point where cost is being pushed onto them, then they deserve to know, but they don't. Another recommendation I had was to delay their Acharya reprocessing facility. If this reprocessing facility opens up, they will produce 8 tons more plutonium, which Japan has shown that the MOX program doesn't actually consume plutonium at a steady rate. So opening this reprocessing facility will be very dangerous in terms of security because another 8 tons of plutonium will be added to the stockpile. And then my third and final recommendation is to determine plans for dry cask storage. So spent fuel pools, like I said, are very close to capacity, and this type of storage is a lot more dangerous than dry cask storage. So in terms of safety, dry cask storage is clearly a smart choice. So that's it. If you have any questions about public perception, which I didn't have time to talk about right now, you're free to ask during the panel. Thank you very much.
Good morning, thank you again. My name is Kelli Kennedy, and I'll be focusing on the German MOX experience. So from the beginning, Germany sought a complete fuel cycle. There was a perceived uranium shortage worldwide, and that led the German government to believe that breeders were not only the future, but a necessity. And so therefore they reasoned that a national complete fuel cycle would also provide the country increased security and independence from outside powers. MOX was introduced at a research reactor in 1966, and then commercially in 1972 in Hina. Germany fabricated MOX from 1972 until 1991 at the Alchem Hina facility in Hesse, Germany. There was a second plant that was 95% construction was completed, but due to political opposition, it was never allowed to start operation. In total, 17 nuclear power plants out of Germany's 35 were licensed for MOX production and not MOX production, but MOX use. Then an 18th was scheduled, but after Fukushima, it was shut down instead of completing its MOX licensing procedures. Here's a look at my initial research questions. Mine were split into MOX use in light water reactors as well as MOX fabrication in light water reactors. As my research went on and I conducted interviews, my questions did change slightly. They evolved, but this is where I started. I won't walk you through each of them, but here they are. So as I mentioned in the beginning, Germany initially sought a complete national fuel cycle. The German government was interested in both the military and economic, or military and energy applications of nuclear energy. The former spurred a lot of domestic debate over the necessity of that, and with the German government insistence on closing the nuclear fuel cycle, it led the public to wonder if really they had ulterior motives other than energy. When President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace came along, it created a lot of excitement, not just within the German government, but within the German population at large, over the possibilities and promise of nuclear energy. Initially, the MOX program there was created to fabricate fuel for fast breeder reactors, but when those did not come along as quickly as expected, the program was retooled and reorganized to produce fuel for light water reactors. When nuclear energy as a whole did not provide the anticipated benefits as quickly as everyone expected when the Atoms for Peace initiative rolled out, nuclear energy, the excitement and buzz around it in Germany quickly began to fade. In 1976, there was an amendment to the German Atomic Energy Act, which required utilities to reprocess. I should say obliged utilities to reprocess. Licensing authorities, before they would grant a license to any utility just for a standard light water reactor, had to first show that they had a back-end solution. And at the time, the only acceptable politically back-end solution was reprocessing, which then snowballed them into using MOX as well. Until 1994, this government policy, which was officially known as non-detrimental utilization, which was their soft way of saying reprocessing, was the government policy. In 1994, it became legal to pursue direct disposal. And that change led to utilities slowly stopping and thinking, well, we don't really have to do this any longer. Reprocessing was done at an early stage. A small-scale government research plant attempts to commercialize reprocessing began in 1985 with the construction of the Wackersdorf facility, but those attempts failed in 1989 in the face of heavy public opposition. In general, German protests were peaceful. This was one instance where the German protests got very violent. 7 years later, in 2005, reprocessing and the transport of spent nuclear fuel was banned in general. Any fuel was allowed to be exported out of the country to the United Kingdom, Belgium, or France to be reprocessed there and then brought back as MOX fuel or just as spent nuclear fuel. But after 2005, there was no longer allowed to be any movement of spent nuclear fuel. After 2005, any waste that was created was placed in interim storage facilities until a final direct disposal option was created and established. Those are all still sitting in interim storage facilities. As these Germany has been pursuing, they've ended all nuclear energy, and as they have closed down these facilities, the facilities themselves are being turned into interim storage facilities. So the nuclear waste is not leaving these nuclear plants, it's just sitting there in a different format. The last MOX fuel assembly fabricated from the fuel that left the country prior to 2005 was inserted in the Emsland reactor in January of 2017. They're no longer inserting any new MOX into reactors. My research uncovered well-developed arguments for and against nuclear energy and MOX in general, which really resulted in an indecisive yo-yo type German nuclear energy policy. In 1998, a new socialist green coalition came into power and came to an agreement in 2000 and decided to phase out all nuclear energy. Their decision was actually placed on hold in 2010 when Chancellor Angela Merkel's government decided instead to actually extend the lifetimes of several German reactors. This decision was reversed quickly and permanently the following year in 2011 after the events of Fukushima. The Fukushima incident is really what pushed German nuclear policy over the edge. It is what kind of solved the problem of Germany's yo-yoing, indecisive nuclear energy policy. It tipped the scales in favor of the anti-nuclear movement. In 2011, as I mentioned earlier, there were in total 17 nuclear power plants were licensed to use MOX. In 2011, there were 17 nuclear power plants in operation. 7 years later, 6 remain, and they're all on track to be shut down in 2022. The German reprocessing really gave the anti-nuclear activists something to latch onto, and that was something along with the transport of spent nuclear fuel and MOX transports that German activists focused on. While Germany was better at security than their neighbors, they were still extremely predictable as their other European neighbors that we've previously heard about. If it's burning inside of you and you really want proof of this, you can find video of MOX transports on YouTube, taken by members of Greenpeace. Activists really focused on the potential side effects of MOX and the plutonium within MOX, without really ever just discussing the likelihood that such side effects would ever occur. And something to keep in mind, they saw great success in this targeted approach. Something to keep in mind is that the events of both 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl really served to physically and psychologically reinforce the arguments put forth by these anti-nuclear and anti-MOX activists. The impact of the anti-nuclear marketing campaign has been huge in Germany. The German Green Party is arguably the most powerful Green Party in the world. They were able to galvanize the population and prove themselves as a force to be reckoned with. Protests were mostly peaceful. As I mentioned earlier, there have been instances of violence, and actually in one instance, death, when sadly a protester, he chained himself to the tracks in order to block or delay the shipment of spent nuclear waste, spent nuclear fuel that was coming to the location, and he could not be taken off the tracks soon enough. Interestingly enough, his death did not deter future protesters from pursuing the same method of protest, and they actually used chains, metal chains, to tie themselves, themselves to the tracks. Instead, police came prepared with ways to break through the chains and get them to safety. Another unique method that was used, this was relayed to me by Sean Burney, the former head of Greenpeace Germany, is that Greenpeace Germany captured they boxed up nuclear waste that was leaking from the French reprocessing facility La Hague, and then sent it to German government and industry officials, which did not earn them any friends. The protests routinely brought about tens of thousands of individuals from all strata of society. An illustration of the impact of this nuclear marketing was the Gorleben protest in November of 2008. Participation ranged from farmers on tractors who were blocking road routes to the facility, and then kindergartners schools were canceled that day, so kindergartners and other school students who were participating in sit-ins across train tracks, and then they also had individuals, they also routinely blocked waterways as well with boats. In total, this particular protest brought out over 15,000 people, and this is just one illustration of many. One of the big takeaways that I discovered is that nuclear industry officials did not do a lot to counter the anti-MOX, anti-nuclear activists' arguments with the potential side effects. And what was even more interesting to me is that through my interviews, the people that I spoke to, whether they be industry or historians, nobody could tell me why more wasn't done to counter these arguments, why more wasn't done to talk about the safety that industry with the safety measures the industry was taking to prevent these potential side effects from ever coming to fruition. The great irony of the German MOX program is that reprocessing is really in the government's desire and insistence on closing the nuclear fuel cycle is really what killed MOX in Germany and what killed the nuclear industry. So something that they did in order to really support and bolster the industry and keep it going is what resulted in its death. A quick glance at my methods. I employed a combination of primary and secondary sources in both English and German, as well as interviews in Germany and France. And interviews were conducted with government officials, current and former members of industry and think tanks, NGOs, and former utilities officials. Thank you.
Okay, folks, we have almost a half hour, and so if you have any questions, just raise your hand. I'll call on you. If you could just please identify yourself and your affiliation, that would be wonderful, and then direct your question to whomever you'd like. Sir?
Hi, thanks. Brilliant presentations. Thanks for orchestrating it. My name is Gilbert Brown. I'm an emeritus professor of nuclear engineering and a former State Department fellow sitting here in State Department row. But I have comments on, or questions on everything. But to this last point, and the German, and particularly about Germany and its, what you call it, yo-yo views of nuclear, I think what I learned, notwithstanding your last remarks, because somewhere in the middle you said something about an ambivalence, at least in the public, towards their view of developing nuclear weapons. And I haven't heard that too much. And that makes a pantload of sense, frankly. That would leave the Germans in this sort of quandary, being so strongly industrialized and the rest of the West, industrialized countries going towards nuclear. I get the whole Island for Peace thing. I get the projections for shortage of uranium and the need to close the fuel cycle. Fermi himself viewed that as the vision with fast reactors. We have a big discussion about that. But this point of view about becoming a weapons state, Germany, the defeated nation of World War II. Can you comment more on that instead of relying on the conclusion of how effective the Greenpeace and the anti-nuclear movement was?
Sure, and if I implied ambivalence, I think I misspoke. So the German population was very adamantly against Germany becoming a weapons state.
Bad word for me.
Okay, they were very adamantly against that, and there was this unclarity about whether the German government was was trying to angle back that way. A lot of the people who were initially part of the founding movement of the German nuclear industry were former military officers. And so I think that also fed into the public's concern in regards to that. And I think that back and forth and the fear of the German public that Germany was trying to become a nuclear weapons state and trying to have this big grand military again, kind of created more distance and made them more prone to wanting nothing to do with nuclear.
Just for clarity, this is in the middle of the Cold War, right?
Mm-hmm.
When the nuclear umbrella supplied, I guess, by us, NATO.
Right, which is part of why I think the German government argued that it would give them greater, not only energy independence, but also security independence. Having the capability to just having that option open.
Thank you.
What I'll just add is that Germany's not the only country that viewed closing the fuel cycle as a way to keep open a nuclear weapons option. So one of our case studies is Switzerland, and our author couldn't make it today, but when he was doing his field research in Switzerland, openly his interviewees, whether they be from industry or government, said, oh yeah, we were keeping open our nuclear weapons option by closing the fuel cycle. And it's interesting because on the record, the industry will say, well, you can't use reactor-grade plutonium in a nuclear weapon. Well, then how does closing the fuel cycle keep open your nuclear weapons option? So it just, it was fascinating to me that people would actually say this on the record in interviews. It was that much of an open secret in Switzerland, not just in Germany. And it shows that there's a little bit of disingenuousness among some in the industry when they insist, as we heard from Hina in Japan, that, oh, well, no one would ever try to make a nuclear weapon from reactor-grade separated plutonium. Other questions? Sir?
Yes, Edward F., visiting fellow at Stanford. Very good discussion of the evils of MOX, but what's missing is what do all these countries think we should do with all this MOX?
Yeah. With all this plutonium?
Well, plutonium, yeah, and some of it's been turned into MOX.
Well, why don't I turn to Neal, because his country, I think, has done the most thinking about this.
Yeah, so the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, which was only established in 2005, but it inherited the thinking from BNFL and the UK AEA before it. They commissioned several studies in the last decade about what to do with not only the civil plutonium that's already separated, but also what is expected to be separated in the future, because even today, Thorpe is reprocessing and continuing its operation, and what to do with spent fuel in the future. So they've looked pretty heavily at this issue. They issued their recommendation in 2014 that they think that they should use the MOX and thermal reactors option to draw down their stockpile of plutonium. They also are expecting that Thorpe will close once the contracts for current reprocessing are finished this year. They've said that for the last couple of years, and there keeps being a little more delay in that. But there's no option expected that Thorpe will continue reprocessing after that point. And simultaneously, just in the last few months, there's also been opened another public consultation, which they do on disposal options. So they've looked at several sites around the UK and focused a lot on the Sellafield site, not necessarily because it's the best geologically, but because it's the most convenient, because most of the things are already stored there. But some other jurisdictions that were being considered for geologic disposal, the local county councils voted to withdraw their applications, and so that process is now starting over again, because it's sort of like in the US. They've gone through it, and then everyone said, no, there's problems with everything, so let's start over and look again. So they're considering direct disposal of fuel in addition to MOX, and what ends up happening, I don't know. It's anyone's guess at this point.
Are they considering direct disposal of plutonium?
They are, yeah, they're considering vitrification. They have, at the National Nuclear Lab, they have several research programs on different types. Hot isostatic processing is their big technology push for creating the vitrified waste form and then direct disposal of that.
Hina, do you want, is Japan looking at other things to do with plutonium?
Japan is looking at transferring its ownership to the UK, but nothing with the plutonium itself. They just don't want to own it anymore, I think, because they have so much.
So the UK, as you may know, a few years ago, it has how many tons? 20? Foreign plutonium in the UK?
That sounds about right, 20
Something around
25.
25 tons of plutonium in the UK, and they've offered to purchase it. That's a potential win-win, because if the UK were not to purchase it, then the only thing these countries could do today to get the plutonium back would be to fabricate it into MOX, which, as we talked about, is very expensive. So it probably would be cheaper for these foreign countries to pay the UK to take their plutonium than to pay somebody to fabricate it into MOX. So the foreign countries would benefit, and the UK would benefit because we get money. And yes, it would have to take ownership of 20 tons of plutonium, but that's just like a little, that's a little delta on what they already have. They're 110s of their own. Now, they have no idea what they're going to do with that plutonium, but if you have no idea what you're going to do with 110, you have no idea what you're going to do with 130, it's not a really big difference. So,
what was that about if you're in a hole?
Yeah. So the other thing I would mention is the author of our France case study is not here. But what comes out of his case is that France officially has a policy of not increasing the size of its stockpile of separated plutonium, and yet every year the size of its stockpile of separated plutonium or unirradiated plutonium increases. And it could fix that problem. It could simply burn more MOX in its reactors, and it doesn't do it. All right? It has enough capacity to fabricate MOX, and it has enough reactors to irradiate more MOX. So it could at least keep steady its stockpile of unirradiated plutonium, but it doesn't. It keeps increasing. And the only possible explanation for that is that every time they make and burn MOX, they lose money. So why would they want to do more of that? And so this is dawning on France. It also has a new policy to reduce the percentage of its energy that's produced from nuclear power from 75% to 50%. And both its producer of MOX and its utility that runs all the reactors both appear to be losing money. And so they're doing some very, very serious thinking about what to do. And they're starting to look at direct disposal of spent nuclear fuel. Now, what to do with so if they would do that, if they would, let's say, stop reprocessing their own spent fuel, then France is one of the few countries that has a serious enough program to use MOX that it could eventually, I think, actually use up its plutonium stockpile in MOX. It still has lots of problems. It has a huge stock of spent MOX, and it is reprocessed a tiny fraction of that, less than 1%. And then it has enormous stocks of spent LEU, and its pools are filling up. So it has lots of problems. But for France is probably the only country, I think, that if it stopped reprocessing, it probably could dispose of its plutonium stockpile in MOX. I think I saw your hand first, and then we'll go here and here. Sir?
Doug Sharp from GW. Thank you so much for this work. It's really important and interesting, immediately relevant to public policy, but I think also illuminative for the challenge of political science about proliferation prevention. And I have three tightly interrelated questions on that topic. First, do you have a sense of why states choose MOX on the basis of this work? Second, do you have any initial thoughts, and you've shared some already, about the relationship between MOX and proliferation latency and proliferation intent? And third, you mentioned that the industry has a perhaps undeveloped perspective on security of plutonium. Is the IAEA better prepared to safeguard plutonium than industry is to secure it? Thank you.
All right. Well,
I could start out on the first part.
Why? Let's start with Valentina and Hina. I think. Yeah, because in part, yeah. Let's start that way, and then we'll come around.
So the first question was on why they choose to do this. So I think in the case of Belgium, which is in some sense the most simple case we have here, where everything went pretty smoothly, I think the choosing MOX was justified by the industry representatives that I talked to as the most rational and economical way to dispose of separated plutonium, which was already there. So they couldn't change that. And there are no official public studies that show that MOX is actually more economical than disposing of separated plutonium, but they say that that would have been the most economical way. But Belgium is a very particular case. It has a very strong scientific community that I think also influenced the government's choice in this sense. And also it's a pioneer when it comes to MOX fuel production and use. The first loading of MOX fuel in a light water reactor on an experimental scale happened in Belgium. So I think they were very confident of being able to use MOX fuel to dispose of plutonium. And they did it. They actually disposed of all their separated plutonium. So I think that was their rationale. It was more economical, it was more rational than disposing of plutonium, because at least they can get energy out of it, right? So that was it. And from an engineering standpoint, it worked. They definitely disregarded some security aspects of it, as I mentioned, and that is a policy problem. But I think that part of the reason is that the scientific community in Belgium was so strong and so influential, and the previous history with MOX fuel, and the fact that there were experimental facilities for MOX fuel production, there had been experimental loading, definitely influenced this choice. And I think in a country that did not have these premises, it would have been a little bit less rational to use MOX fuel. In their case, I think this was the reason to use MOX fuel anyway.
Hina, you want to talk about Japan's decision?
Sure. I think Japan, the reason that they gave, which was a lack of energy independence, was actually true at that time when they started the MOX program. As they went on, they realized that it wasn't a brilliant idea that they originally thought it was, but I think at that time they truly believed that this was going to solve their energy needs. In terms of whether or not they want to be a latent state, this is an interesting question. Maybe at some point, yes, but today they have enough plutonium to make 6,000 weapons. So like, why keep going? It doesn't really make sense. They're so insistent that they will keep going. So maybe there's, I don't know, a little bit of the strategy is to have the plutonium in case it's needed in the military sense. But I truly also think it's because of the sunk cost. The reprocessing facilities have been built. They spent, I think, $1 billion just building the facility. So at this point, I think they've gone all in. So pulling out is going to be a huge politically costly decision, especially because the way Japan frames MOX fuel, they kind of tell the public that it can be recycled over and over and over again. We know that's not the case. So now, if they decide to end reprocessing and end MOX fuel, then the one really big deal is the Amori Prefecture, which is where all utilities have spent their spent fuel. So the people of Amori Prefecture will ask for that spent fuel to be sent back to where it came from, which is a very politically dangerous decision. So it's a lot of things in Japan. I'm not sure if they want nuclear weapons. I didn't get the sense that they did, that was their biggest reasoning.
Either you two want to add anything?
Just similar to what Valentina mentioned with the Belgium case, Germany German industry became very efficient at using MOX fuel, and they were very good at it. I think there was a lag between the industry's confidence in the government position and overall public opinion, and I think the industry missed the opportunity to kind of support and give all of the good reasons and convince the public of why they were doing a good job and why MOX should perhaps continue. They also saw it, although the government did obligate MOX use, the industry, a common industry argument until the late 1980s was that it was the most environmentally friendly option because you were getting rid of waste that was just going to sit there, and also an economic benefit because you were, if you didn't use MOX, you were leaving just energy sources just sitting in the ground or at a nuclear facility somewhere.
So a few different perspectives. So looking at the UK, at least in the 90s, in the late 80s, early 90s, one of the major things that happened, at least under the Thatcher government, was the move to open up utility industries to competition. So that change in the electricity industry was a big shift for nuclear power, which had always been government owned up to that point. And after that shift happened, although British Energy, which ended up owning most of the fleet and eventually it spun off into other things, they actually looked at using MOX fuel during the 90s and concluded that it was just too expensive economically. But looking at it today, the NDA is interested in looking at MOX fuel in addition to direct disposal because there is the potential for revenue from selling the fuel and turning that into electricity. Now, whether the government would own its own power plants again in order to make that happen is an open question. There's definitely a lot of resistance to that because of the push for open markets and competition, and I think there would be a lot of people very upset about that. There's always the possibility that you can incentivize the fuel to a commercial operator, and someone like Horizon Nuclear Power or some of these others that are developing plants could decide that they want to buy it. But the expectation that the NDA is seeing, at least when they did their analysis before, was that in net, you're going to spend less money turning it into MOX and then using the revenue from that to offset some of those costs versus direct disposal. But the uncertainties on those kind of calculations are so large that they can't really say definitively either way. I think other countries have seen that too, that have considered this. I've seen people that say, well, they're about the same. So I don't think anyone has really clear answers for that.
So I'll just add a few things on your three questions, and then we'll move on to the next questions. I think there's been a learning process, and I really think people thought plutonium was going to be a valuable commodity. I think they would be shocked to find out that today plutonium has a negative value. If you have plutonium and you want to get rid of it, you have to pay someone to take your plutonium. They told me that directly in the Netherlands, and it's come out of several of our other cases. On the latency thing, the only thing I would say is, not to take a shot at colleagues of mine, but there are academics who publish papers in major journals that say there is no connection between civilian nuclear programs and weapons program and intent. And all I can say is, when you do the case work, when you do the field work, people tell you the opposite. They say, we went for this to keep open our nuclear weapons option. So, sorry, if I didn't get to peer review those papers. And then the last thing is the IAEA better prepared to safeguard this stuff. I mean, there's safeguards in this physical protection, and I don't think anyone thinks that the IAEA is going to stop a country from taking its plutonium from this facility and putting it into a bomb in that facility. It's not what the IAEA is dedicated towards. And in terms of physical protection, this countries are not taking this seriously, and I don't know. And maybe it's got to happen once. Some of this stuff's got to be stolen and put into a bomb, and then people say, "Oh yeah, we need to do some retro fixes." Okay, next question. I would just say this is Milton Honig, and I just want to say that Hina cites your work from 1989 in her paper.
International Center for Terrorism Studies. First of all, comment about why this love of plutonium goes back to the belief in the shortage of uranium, and that's a pretty simple explanation, I think. People were driven by that. Some people are still driven by it, but then...
That's true, but what you find out from the cases is that really the reason people reprocessed is because there was nothing else that they knew of to do with their stuff. Okay. And so I think it was a lot of local kind of lack of options.
Well, maybe so. That gets to my question, though. What are the general attitudes in these countries toward reprocessing spent MOX fuels to use it a second time around? Alan mentioned it. I'm remembering 1% statement about France.
Less than 1%.
But the only other time it's been mentioned here. So here's the question that comes up: what is the attitude towards Zoom?
I don't think there was any interest in the UK, at least economically.
So I mean, this is mainly in the French case. They have proved that they can do it, and once they proved that they can do it, they stopped. Now the way it works is that if you reprocess spent MOX, the plutonium that you get can be recycled once. If you were to try to recycle it a second time, you would have too low a percentage of fissile isotopes, so then you'd have to mix it with some higher grade plutonium. So why is it that they proved the concept and then stopped? Well, one thing is that it slows down the operation of their reprocessing plant. They do not have a separate reprocessing plant for this. And because of the extra work that is required, you have to dilute the material, because when you have spent MOX, you're dealing with something that has something around 6% plutonium, whereas when you're dealing with spent LEU, you have 1% plutonium. So the La Hague facility is optimized for 1% plutonium, and now you have feed that's coming in that's 6% plutonium. And so that means there's a lot of work that has to be done on the front end of that back end, and that slows down the operation of the whole facility. So it is an economic nightmare, and as I said, the plutonium you're getting out is of a lower grade, and so it's going to have a less energy value. So there's lots of reasons not to do it, no reason to do it. As I said, also it would shoot up their plutonium stockpile, because you're getting 6 times as much plutonium from each batch of spent fuel. There's really no reason to do it. They've thought about it, but they're not going to do it. I don't think anyone thinks they're going to do it. Dan?
Dan Fenstermark, the State Department. I kind of 2 specific questions. Listening with great interest in case studies and one claim I've heard made twice. One time in listening remarks by Alan and also by Valentina is on physical protection, which was sort of touched on before an earlier question. That the physical protection at leaving side transportation for now at reactors is really no different when there's MOX present and when there's not. And all these countries are adherent to the Convention on Physical Protection, have to adhere to INFICERT 225 guidelines and so forth. And fresh MOX fuel is considered a direct use material, so it's subject to higher physical protection standards. Are you making this claim that they're not doing anything different, anything better than LEU standards, or that it's just as convenient to make all the standards for physical protection enough to satisfy if there's MOX, fresh MOX there, or if there's not?
So I think my problem in dealing with this question for Belgium is that I encountered so much resistance from government officials. Government officials would not talk to me. They have been instructed not to talk about any nuclear related issue because they're phasing out. So the only points the points I presented are the only ones I could get from the consultant I talked to, which dealt with safety and security issues directly. So you're right. It's either the standards are so high that they're the same for both, but the reason why I claimed what I claim is that if you compare what he told me to what is in place, it's actually the same, and what is prescribed by the IEA and Euratom are the same standards that are there. So it's really hard to, I don't think they're breaking any law or standard, but I think that just rationally, it seems to me that even if like the standards were so high, it would seem rational to me if there is that type of material being used, they should be higher, no matter if they are already compliant with the standards that are in place. But the claim that they are the same, that is a fact. The ones that are in place for reactors used in LEU and those that were in place for reactors used in MOX were the same. So that is a claim that is backed by a direct conversation with somebody who dealt with this.
I think as you want, let's take these, we're out of time, but can we take like 5? Let's take these 2 questions and then we'll answer them, and then afterwards, if you have more questions, just come on and talk to us. So, sir.
Miles Pumper from CNS and the Fissile Material Working Group. I guess for Alan, how much, and maybe in the Japanese case too, and a lot of this is about, as you were saying, like, we needed to do something with the spent fuel, and I think the early perception was you had to move it off, you had to put it in the pools and then you had to move it somewhere. And certainly in the last 20, 30 years, dry cask has been seen as a much more viable option. So, I mean, how much of this is kind of a kind of lag effect of people not, before dry cask became seen, improvements technologically, and people haven't kind of caught up with that in a policy sense, versus, continuing interest in MOX, and how much is, if you're looking at Japan, I know that, you mentioned dry cask, but my understanding from people like Frank von Hippel is that some of the sites already have dry cask. So, is this just, okay, let's move, finally you have to sort of sell people on dry cask as a solution for the time being, and let's change the policy to adapt to that, and let's get rid of these sort of lagging kind of policy instruments.
Okay. Well, let's just take the last question and we'll answer them both together.
So, I know you guys focused on MOX and light water reactors. Hopefully you're aware of, and maybe somehow you could embrace it, the Gen 4, what we call advanced reactors, that are revisiting not just LMFDRs, but a whole panoply of reactor types, including fast molten salt reactors, that don't go to MOX, keep the fuel in a chemistry format that doesn't separate into the more problematic streams. I wonder if you're looking at that at all, because what's past is past. It's like legacy. We're going to have to do interim storage. It seems that's the state of the art. Just go up to New Jersey and visit Holtec or any of the companies that can supply this. But in the future, if we're gonna have a clean, green energy supply, it's apparent to many that to preclude the use of nuclear is not gonna get us where we wanna be. And the German case is a really good data point. You can say no to nuclear, but then you're saying yes to a lot of CO2, no matter how many windmills you hug, right? It's just not, the numbers count. So it's not a question, it's more of a comment, but it is a question about how you might expand what you're saying to lead towards maybe an application that captures the values that were inherent in the 50s and 60s of closing the fuel cycle in advanced reactors. Because if you're just trying to use light water reactors to do this, you may be using the wrong tool.
So,
I realize
I'll
it's
just say something quick about both those questions, and then I'll ask my colleagues about their views if they want to offer them. On that question of Gen 4, all these technologies are different, and we can't assume that the problem you have with one technology is going to apply to another. But one of the things that came out of the study, and I did not know it coming into the study, it's one of the reasons you do research, is that when you start recycling plutonium, you get a lot of headaches. And the headaches mainly have to do with the toxicity and pyrophoricity of plutonium. And your costs skyrocket. And then you have a temptation to cut corners, and then your facilities don't work. And every technology is different, but my strong suspicion is that this is going to occur with any technology that attempts to recycle plutonium. And so I hope to go to Korea and talk to them about their pyroprocessing and fast reactor strategy, because I do think that they're going to run into similar problems. Will they? For sure? I can't say for sure, but that's my suspicion. And when you're dealing with a technology, nuclear power, that's already more expensive than its competitors, and you have liberalized energy markets, if I were investing, that's not where I would put my next dollar, personally. As for dry cask, in our cases, it's really most relevant for Japan because most of our other cases, they phased out nuclear power. And as Hina was mentioning, they're looking at dry cask, but the problem is the Japanese public are not suckers. They know that if you put it in something that seems fairly stable, and you say, oh, don't worry, it's only for 50 years, that they realize they may have it forever. And so it makes sense economically, it makes sense environmentally, it may not make sense politically. And so that's the tension. And of course, those parts of the government in Japan that still are, there are some real, what did Sean call them, the plutonium theocracy?
Priesthood.
Plutonium priesthood. He's so good. The plutonium priesthood, they still want to do this. They want to, Hina, I think, alluded to the fact that there's also a plutonium fab facility that they're hoping to get online at Rokasha, the quote-unquote JMOX. And so they're happy that the Japanese public doesn't want dry cask storage, because this is their chance to keep pushing their plutonium strategy. So yeah, I think the thing about dry cask is completely right on the substance, but maybe not on the politics. We'll see. We'll see. Other comments?
Yeah, Japan has moved towards dry cask, but they do it very secretly because they don't want the public to find out. But maybe in the next few years we'll hear
There
more
were
about
dry
it.
casts at Fukushima.
Yeah, there were.
And they survived the
They did.
tsunami. And it's not a strategy for long-term disposal. It's just a practical way to get. This is the proverbial mountain in Moab.
Right, but
you have to ship it somewhere.
As Hina was talking about in Aomori Prefecture, they say we won't allow dry cask storage unless you start the Rokasha reprocessing plant, because otherwise we think interim is permanent. So that's the. Anyway, let me turn it to my colleagues. I dominated.
I'll just say in the UK, this is intimately linked with their reprocessing plans. There are a couple of AGR reactor sites that actually did and still to this day use dry storage. It's not dry casks, it's special maids that store the CO2, but they really pushed to do that, especially in Scotland. And others were sort of on the reprocessing track and really wanted to sign the contracts with the NFL to have their used fuel reprocessed. So even within the UK, different operators had different ideas about what should be done and why. At Sizewell B, they're currently storing everything in pools and looking at doing dry cask in the future, so they're not planning to continue reprocessing going forward. The other thing I'll say, so I'll comment a little bit about Gen 4 and what things we have in the future. You know that most of the Gen 4 technologies are actually thermal spectrum. Some of them are fast, but some, like the molten salt system, is still a thermal system.
Not the
So,
chloride molten salt.
okay, chloride. So the older
Lithium,
Gen 4.
Look up Elysium.
Yeah. So Elysium is looking at chloride salts rather than fluoride salts. But depending on what your goal is, I think regardless of what the technology is, you should really consider what is your conversion ratio. And if you're really trying to make a burner that you want to reduce the plutonium stockpile, then you have a design that is going that way. And if you want something that's going to be self-sustaining, then you might want to get close to that conversion ratio of 1, where you produce about the same amount of fuel as you consume, rather than making the breeder type reactors, which are producing more, and then you have surplus on your hands at the end of the day, which are very difficult to make, but we've done it. In fact, we've even bred fuel from a light water reactor, which is thermal spectrum. So all these technologies have lots of different options. Whether the recycling of plutonium should be intimately tied with our future use of nuclear power for climate change mitigation, I would argue you should consider the two things to be interlinked to a certain extent, but not necessarily mutually exclusive. I don't see that you have to go down a full closed fuel cycle with fast reactors in order to mitigate our climate change challenges this century. I think we should hedge our bets technologically much more widely than that, because we have a lot of risk in development. Let's make it right in here.
Foreclose the option based on this issue.
Right.
It's kind of it's related, but it's the reverse of what you're saying.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your attention and all your questions. It's great when there are more questions than there is time. That's really flattering and gratifying. So thanks very much.